We're going to go ahead and get started in the interest of time. So I'll be introducing our next two speakers. Dr. Sanjay Basu is an assistant professor of medicine at Stanford University. He is a primary care physician and an epidemiologist with a focus on improving public health interventions that address cardiovascular disease risk among low-income populations. His research includes randomized trials of interventions in community-based settings and the development of epidemiologic models, integrating the trial data with health system data to improve the targeting and delivery of programs. He has previously worked at Partners in Health and Oxfam GM, then co-founded the organization Possible Health. He currently serves on several expert advisory panels and was selected as one of the top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine in 2013 for his co-authorship of the book, The Body Economic. Our second speaker, Dr. Sandro Galea, is a physician and epidemiologist and currently the dean and professor at the Boston University School of Public Health. Dr. Galea is interested in the social production of health of urban populations with a focus on the causes of brain disorders, particularly common mood disorders and substance abuse. He has particular interest in the consequences of mass trauma and conflict worldwide, occurring as a result from the September 11th attacks, Hurricane Katrina, conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa, and the American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He has published over 500 scientific articles, 50 chapters and commentaries, and 9 books, and was named one of Time Magazine's Epidemiology Innovators in 2006. Dr. Galea also serves frequently on advisory groups and has formerly served as chair of the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene's Community Services Board and as a member of its health board. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sanjay Basu and Dr. Sandro Galea.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I've been asked to review some of the emerging research in the area of study around social and economic policies and their impact on population health equity. And I'd like to focus myself a bit on recent data and emerging studies in one particular realm. If we believe that we can explain little of the variations and disparities across the socioeconomic gradient in the United States through health care access, utilization, and quality alone, and certainly little of it through genetics and other omics that represent fixed biologic effects, then we're left with the fact that much of the socioeconomic disparity is at least correlated with social and economic exposures, income, education, wealth, and so on. And if that's the premise, and at least some of those correlations are causal, then we should be interested as epidemiologists in the social and economic policies that theoretically are at least purportedly intended to affect social and economic exposures. And in particular, I'll focus on so-called safety net programs, which I'll define as generally government-run, taxpayer-funded programs that try to redistribute assets of some kind or another across particularly the income gradient or in other aspects of disadvantage. And so my central focusing questions will be around how do we even study safety nets in terms of population health equity if they're truly affecting the social determinants that we think they're supposed to? And if they're not, as I'll show you often, they're quite blunt at best, as Dr. Munich alluded to. How might we improve their design? So in the United States, we're frequently and often correctly criticized for not actually spending as much as other OECD nations in terms of a percent of GDP on true social safety nets after we account for the large spending on health care safety nets. But we still do spend a large portion of federal outlays on some types of safety nets. The third item down is perhaps one of our largest social-oriented safety nets, SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or what used to be called food stamps. And I'll take a moment to use that as a paradigmatic example of some of the challenges of studying safety nets, as well as some of the challenges of trying to have safety nets actually improve population health equity. So a bit more about SNAP in order to ensure we're all on the same page. SNAP is very interesting historically. It's not run by the Department of Health and Human Services. It's under the Department of Agriculture. And some historians have criticized that, in fact, it is so well funded in part because it serves as the largest indirect subsidy of corporate food manufacturers. It's currently funded around the tunes of $70 billion and covers about 14% of the United States. So 1 in 7 Americans are on what we used to call food stamps. So from the perspective of population health equity, if we believe, as all statistics seem to suggest, that major disparities in healthcare and health outcomes, rather, in the United States are often nutritionally related, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and so forth, then shouldn't we be studying the largest nutrition program in the country? Interestingly, very few studies have occurred on this program, maybe the best since around 2012. Most of the studies on SNAP are actually conducted by economists and have non-health outcomes. A little bit more about SNAP. Typically, one can qualify for SNAP if you're less than 185% of the federal poverty level, but it's notable that there are 13 asterisks to that, suggesting a little bit about the nature of safety net enrollment, which I'll get back to in the United States, and its complexity. The way in which one receives SNAP is that on average, people receive about $4 per person per day. It's not adjusted for cost of living or cost of food. It's figured out by the Agriculture Department based on your household income relative to household size, using an annually updated formula that looks at average food prices in the United States, and essentially is something called a thrifty food plan, which says, given current nutritional recommendations or an agricultural interpretation of those, how could you achieve the minimum amount of nutritional guidelines if you spent a third of your household income and then had the SNAP benefit on top? Effectively, as many people have pointed out, this means you have to purchase a lot of canned foods and some lentils for protein, make a lentil soup at home, freeze it, and defrost a bit of it every day. And needless to say, that's not what typically occurs. So since about 2012, a number of highly publicized studies, this one coming out of this institution, have tried to correlate SNAP to various health outcomes. In this case, SNAP was associated with worsening outcomes and risk factors related to heart disease, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome overall, when SNAP participants were compared to SNAP non-participants. The authors of the study published a separate analysis that also observed SNAP participants as compared to non-participants that were matched by age, sex, and income to have less whole grain consumption, more consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, sodas, and the like, and more refined grain intake. But this type of study also highlights one of the challenges of studying social safety nets. That is, if we are to compare SNAP participants and SNAP non-participants, or participants and non-participants in any safety net program, then of course we have the difficulty that we often do in social epidemiology of unobserved confounders. Are these people fundamentally different? To media, popular media outlets, the differences were causal from the safety net itself to the worsening nutrition outcomes. So how might we overcome the challenges of studying social safety nets from an epidemiologic perspective? In this scientific audience, of course, if it was ethically possible and practically possible, we'd love to do randomized controlled trials. The beauty of randomization being it simply helps us, if we have a large enough sample size, reduce our chances of those unobserved factors, like the personal histories of individuals, which may predispose them both to enrolling in a social safety net program or not, and influence their nutrition. Many other safety nets also have factors we can believe that may be very difficult to quantify, but are life course factors that influence both your likelihood of enrolling in a safety net and your health outcomes. And yet, what we typically do in social epidemiology, as illustrated at the top, is various matching procedures. For example, propensity score matching. What we say is, let's take somebody in the social safety net, let's say a 34-year-old Indian physician in California, and who's not participating in SNAP, and find a 34-year-old Indian physician in California who is participating in SNAP, match them on all those observed characteristics, and then attribute the remaining difference in nutrition to the SNAP program. as my somewhat silly example illustrates, it may be, first of all, very hard to find a 34-year-old Indian physician in California who's participating in SNAP. I haven't found one yet. And this so-called common support problem means that with many matching procedures, we can only conclude about the people for whom we have a match, excluding perhaps large portions of the population, especially when we're studying programs that are targeted towards the desperately poor. But a second problem also arises. The assumption behind many matching methods, known as strongly ignorable treatment assignment, which is a fancy way of saying that once we've matched on all these observed characteristics, age, sex, race, income, nothing's left over that is both related to your likelihood of being in the safety net and related to your health. And that's a really hard assumption, I would argue, when studying safety net programs. So economists have typically done a second approach, an instrumental variable analysis. An instrument being some random factor that relates to your health only by way of somewhat randomly influencing you into the safety net program or not. For instance, some states require you to be fingerprinted before you can complete your enrollment in SNAP. Others do not. Turns out that this doesn't correlate very much to red or blue. In fact, it's more blue states for weird historical reasons. So this is an influencer, something that can push the same person towards enrolling in SNAP or maybe discourage them from enrolling in SNAP. And presumably, we can check, the fingerprinting is not otherwise related to your nutrition except by way of influencing you into SNAP. The problem with instruments is A, they can often be very hard to find and think of, and B, even when we do, it's not quite like a randomized trial where somebody is physically taking you and putting you in the intervention group or the control group. The problem of weak instruments is that they may influence you a little bit, but like the fingerprinting, it's not everything. There's so many other influencers. And so it's kind of like having contamination in a trial. Some of the control groups going into the intervention group, some of the intervention groups going into the control group. What might we do? One of the strategies that we've been increasingly using attempts to combine some of the benefits of matching and instrumental variable analysis in order to overcome a few of the limitations of both methods. The approach, which is variably called near-far matching, has been worked on perhaps most by Scott Lorch at UPenn and some of the matching teams at UPenn, and also my colleague Mike Baiocchi at Stanford. And the idea is as follows. Suppose you first match people to be very similar on observed characteristics. Now here you still have the limitation that you have to find a match. They're very near to each other on all their observables, age, sex, income, etc. But then you also simultaneously match them to be far on the values of an instrumental variable. They are a very similar person who lives in, one who lives in a state where there's fingerprinting, another who lives in a state where there's not fingerprinting. As Lorch and colleagues have shown, this actually increases the strength of a weak instrument. It essentially makes it more and more like a matched pair randomized trial. The influencer, the random influence of the instrument, is much stronger if you have otherwise similar people, and the instrument is what's very different among them. It's like reducing contamination in a trial. The interesting thing is when you use this type of approach and reanalyze SNAP and its association with nutrition-related health outcomes, almost all of the associations go away. The associations between SNAP and heart disease risk factors, an increased risk of type 2 diabetes, obesity, and so on, disappear. They either become slightly protective, SNAP being slightly protective of health, or neutral, a wash with very large confidence intervals, which I'll get to in a moment. There's one exception, which I'll illustrate here, which is a residual marginally significant at a p.05 level, although not significant anymore if you correct for multiple testing, among long-term, more than a decade-long users of SNAP, particularly women, and the probability of being obese and of having a higher body mass index. So what I conclude from this is that A, there's probably a lot of noise, meaning a lot of unobserved factors that may be both influencing people into a safety net and influencing their health. And at best, SNAP might be neutral or slightly protective, but that poses the other question, which I think is a more important question. Why is it not even more beneficial in terms of population health equity? We shouldn't hope to find a neutral result for something affecting 1 in 7 American adults. There have been 3 major theories in the literature of how SNAP might become more effective. I had particularly supported the second 2 of these theories, and I want to present a little bit of data that continues to emerge that has discouraged me. And reflecting a little bit of Dr. Munich's comments, has highlighted where we might not be doing as good enough of a job of not just finding theories that are necessary, but theories that are sufficient. So the three theories, which are not mutually exclusive by any chance, are number one, the theory that in this audience is probably least popular, and that maybe in a very clinical medicine audience, as I found is most popular, which is that there's inadequate health promotion, not enough behavior change or behavior change interventions in the population receiving SNAP. The second and third theories, probably more popular in the social epi audience, are the lack of availability of healthy foods and conversely, the excessive availability of unhealthy foods. And similarly, the third theory, the lack of affordability of healthy foods and conversely, the extraordinary cheapness of calorie-dense, nutrient-poor foods. Let me go through each of these in turn. Perhaps least surprising to this audience is the rather remarkable inefficacy of the health promotion strategies for improving nutrition. Sometimes I'm reading the health promotion literature, and to be very critical, it feels like reading a religious movement type of text in which the Messiah is coming tomorrow and we keep missing him. We have an extraordinary number of behavior change trials, each increasingly complex, multi-level, multi-component, extraordinarily intensive. Some of them feel like occupations. And yet, still I can't find consistent evidence that health education alone or various forms of health education and behavior change produce meaningful and sustained changes in nutrition or nutrition-related health outcomes. Yet, in the post-behavior change intervention surveys, people reflect high levels of knowledge, explicit knowledge about what is healthy, how to obtain it, how to cook it, and so on. So what about the neighborhood level aspects, the contextual aspects, the price and economic aspects? I had for a long time hoped for some more positive results, but I've increasingly been finding that at least of the 7 demonstration studies, for example, introducing a supermarket into an urban or rural area where prices of healthy foods are low, prices of unhealthy foods are higher, the unhealthy foods are less available, culturally relevant foods are available, the distance to the supermarket is lower. All these things that I had argued would be very important, that the randomized, well-controlled studies are essentially neutral. Not robust, profound evidence coming out from these new neighborhood grocery stores, certainly not of sustained nutritional benefits that I would have hoped for, or their associated health outcomes. Similarly, reducing price or increasing purchasing power. Reducing the price in a very large demonstration study done in Massachusetts by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, a huge subsidy, 30% subsidy on fruits and vegetables, resulted in what I would describe as a clinician as a clinically meaningless improvement in the amount of fruits and vegetables consumed, not really any impact on other nutritional indices. Conversely, some studies have had a little bit more power in the amount of benefit from increasing prices of certain unhealthy foods such as sugar-sweetened beverages, although the level of the taxes that have been implemented are so small that it's hard to extract much of an effect. Not what I was expecting, a rather depressing result. What if we combined these components, the best behavior change, the marketing geniuses promoting things appropriately, combine it with pricing, combine it with increased availability? Overall evidence so far, not so sufficient. And effectiveness on a scale of 1 to 5, marginally increasing above 1 in a meta-analysis of 33 studies so far. So I think as a scientist, when we're faced with these kinds of results, we have 2 choices. We can either double down on our theory, say it must be correct, the trials were not done well enough, it's not a large enough sample size, it's not the right population. If we do a bigger trial, spend more money, we'll find the smaller effect size that must be there. My colleague reflects on the other option we have. He has a little unicorn with a rainbow coming out of its tail on his desk, and it's to remind him that we, as scientists, have to deal with data. And when data is insufficient, we would love to live in a world where rainbows come out of unicorns. But we must stick to the data. And so let's revisit our conceptual model for a moment. Why might these safety nets, even when we go all out in some really nice interventions to try to assist in improving, in this case, nutritional outcomes, why are these safety nets not working as well as we hope? Let's revisit the fundamental concepts of what we think is going on so that we can develop some new theory, or at least add theory that we could test. In this case, with food insecurity and hunger, we have a very interesting component of the conceptual model of why this might be affecting nutritional health outcomes, and particularly health equity, that we haven't considered with the three theories so far. In this case of the SNAP program, it's called the food stamp cycle. With other programs, it's often called the pay cycle. But essentially, what is happening to the user of the food stamps, or SNAP? It's something very fundamental to the nature of the program. Every month, they get now a debit card rather than a SNAP that is refilled. Every month, a lump sum of cash is deposited into this debit card. And every month, people go out and spend on very calorie-dense food items and nutrient-poor food items, and then towards the end of the month, run out of money. So purely at a descriptive level, people go and purchase food at big box stores, the Walmarts of the world, purchase with the plan of trying to fulfill their needs for a month, and then often crash towards the end of the month. This has very immediate health impact. First of all, emergency room visits and hospitalizations for hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, spike among low-income groups at the end of each month. And emergency room visits and hospital admissions for hyperglycemia among diabetics, people having too much blood sugar, spike at the beginning of each month. But this is not occurring for nutritionally unrelated random events and random diseases like appendicitis. But at a broader level as well, with new data linkages, we can understand a little bit about how this cycle is also affecting the way people use safety nets. This large new survey has directly linked among the same people the prices of the food in their area and the prices they purchase, the availability, their actual consumption with 24-hour dietary recalls among the SNAP participants, matched non-participants who are eligible but not participating, which is about half of people who are eligible, and higher income groups. And interestingly, SNAP participants in particular, but also others, are not going to their neighborhood grocery stores. They're not going to the one closest to them. They're not even going to the one that's cheapest for food. They're going about once a month to the Walmart, which is often further than the closest several stores, than even some of the friendlier stores if you look at customer satisfaction. Because they're not just buying food, they're buying diapers and soap, all the other monthly needs, as their pay cycles and safety net cycles are going through these crazy periods of desperation and then sudden cash. Desperation and sudden cash. This may help explain a bit about why these new supermarkets are going out of business as opposed to actually doing what we would hoped. There's some popular theory in the economics literature, much of it developed at this institution, around what might be going on in the context of such severe desperation of poverty. The idea being that under profound amounts of scarcity, one becomes externally focused, sometimes focused in a good way on the short term, survival. For example, in an economic game, those individuals who are given less money to start with in the beginning of the game did profoundly well in the game as compared to those who were given more at the beginning. They were extremely focused, except when given a poverty trap as well in the game, high interest loans. Then the loans were taken immediately to help galvanize the points in the game, and people did much worse. This is all a nice theoretical experiment, but also when done among farmers in India, depending on the cycle of the farming season, the same individuals were less able to perform cognitive tasks during periods of scarcity than they were during periods of plenty. And especially during the periods of scarcity, they were better able to make short-term decisions than longer ones, the chaos of poverty basically making one really cognitively focused on the immediate survival. The implications in terms of safety nets are potentially important. The theory that would be derived out of this improved conceptual framework potentially is that suppose if we can't do what one would hope, that is increase the amount of benefits, something that seems politically untenable in the US at the moment, can we consider redesigns of the nature of the benefits. We have genuine equipoise between two hypotheses. One is that if the scarcity idea is true, that we could, instead of a once monthly huge lump sum, distribute the same monthly amount in weekly installments. The alternative hypothesis is this would make things even worse, just create hell for people who are already marginally surviving. We've been trying to test this through two ways. One is a natural experiment in Peru. Peru used to administer its cash program, welfare program, twice a month, and just because of a banking system change, started administering it once a month. Same total monthly amount. Before, when it was more frequent, people tended to consume less sweets, soft drinks, prepared foods, and other unhealthy items, including alcohol and tobacco. And then once monthly, started this massive monthly cycle, along with much less healthy purchases. We've now started testing it in a different way. My colleague Hilary Seligman at UCSF has convinced the board of San Francisco to start a fruit and vegetable voucher system. And like many other city voucher systems, it's been found that those people who end up getting weekly vouchers, as opposed to getting them once monthly, depending on the distribution site's preference, end up actually using them more, as well as actually having more fundamental dietary changes that reflect overall improved nutrition. The same things have been found with a particular distribution variation among women, infants, and children on the WIC voucher program. But not everything is rosy just from one design element. And the second problem I wish to address is how we think about the nature of safety nets. A very large portion, about a fifth of people, were not even able to use the voucher who were eligible. And similarly, 20% of people eligible for SNAP aren't even bothering to participate. Maybe that's due to the inadequate benefit, $4 per person per day. But even during the stimulus period, where that nearly doubled for some, the same statistic arose. So are we also not considering some of the daily chaos of poverty? Many of those unable to use the vouchers had injury or illness and housing instability. And this brings me to some of the core questions that we've been asking about safety nets, and why I think maybe those core questions need to be reformulated a little. A few of the core questions are, should these be very individually oriented, risk factor oriented safety nets, or very broad? Food vouchers, housing vouchers, disability vouchers, social safety net vouchers, cash welfare. You have so many that it might take all day to fill out all the application forms, or maybe even a week. And it's essentially a daily occupation to continue your enrollment, go to all the different offices, and so on. Conditional or unconditional? Often the debate is really about worthiness. If we give unconditional cash benefits, are people going to be responsible with them? What about the question about efficacy and the health outcome, depending on if they're conditional or unconditional? Some of what I've learned, as Peter Munich described, was from the studies around the welfare reforms. The temporary assistance for needy families was one of the major transitions in the United States. Welfare became quite conditional and quite temporary. And it's interesting, in addition to the randomized trials he mentioned, which showed a bump in mortality despite increases in the transition from welfare to work, we've also been studying some of the data that are more observational and trying to answer a question about how we can follow people for further periods when the randomized trials end over a short period. It's difficult. As he mentioned, the primary population effect is single mothers. Who are their control groups? You have married mothers, single non-mothers. These are highly imperfect control groups. And typically, in both the economics and epidemiological study realm, people use a so-called difference in difference approach. You pick the best control group you can, you assume they have linear secular trends that are parallel, and the only deviation from those parallel trends is whatever the policy had. But you have to assume a lot there. I found very interesting this paper by Abadi and colleagues at Princeton, which tries to at least overcome some of those limitations of having an imperfect control group. It takes several imperfect control groups and then creates a weighting schema, a synthetic control group. Suppose you have an intervention in California. There's no, as I'm told often, no good control group for California for observable and unobserved reasons. I think it's all marijuana. But anyway, you can take several samples from other states and weight them based on observable characteristics, and then also measure the degree of time varying unobserved confounders that's causing differences. And as Abadi shows nicely, create a synthetic control over time. When studying welfare and reform in health, we got very consistent findings, as were for the randomized trials, over longer periods up to the present day, that this turning of the welfare towards conditionality and temporariness, in spite of increasing work, was generally associated with worse outcomes, particularly prominently so when we use the synthetic control method as opposed to the classic difference in differences. But also notice one other thing. The effects are highly varied. The effect sizes are quite different between the methods. And in some cases, the confidence intervals are enormous. I'll come back to that in a moment. How about more sustained and less conditional safety net benefits? The Earned Income Tax Credit is one of those in the United States, perhaps the last one. My colleague David Rakoff used somewhat of a natural experiment in which periods of time in which people mostly receive their income tax credit were compared to those times where they don't. This is a tax rebate that's essentially a lump sum once annual benefit for people who are low enough income to qualify. And in general, health became better through this tax benefit. But of 60 factors studied, the health outcomes were sort of all over the place. The confidence intervals, again, large. And so many people have concluded, well, these types of studies suggest conditionality and temporariness are worsening health. That may be true, but I think the bigger conclusion is blunt instruments are very blunt. And we might not be asking the right questions. We're asking them in blocks, as if the population involved is monolithic. Should we be doing it weekly versus monthly, conditional or unconditional, temporary or permanent? And we've been treating this population based on one idea, that they all happen to be less than a certain dollar amount coming into their household per year. There's no reason to believe that those people are homogeneous simply because of that one index. So, what I think is emerging on the horizon and has just started is a sense that we might be able to do a bit better, perhaps, and I'll show some of the preliminary data, if we rethink this from an individual perspective. Instead of looking by risk factor, food, housing, cash benefits, and so on, when many of the people who are at the recipient end are often the same, there's just a series of ones and zeros in terms of whether they're enrolled or unenrolled in one or more of these at a moment. Think from their perspective. Have a single office, a single application, a single case manager, and then think iteratively. Does this individual need this component or not? Need the conditionality? Need it for longer periods? And how do we assess? Some of these integrated and iterative safety nets in which many things are combined, often first housing and then adding on a food voucher type of system, a cash benefit system, and then medical and psychiatric services typically. These integrated safety nets that have started usually at the city level, because that's where the political will often is, have sometimes tested their studies by randomized trials, which I'll show you, and increasingly also by so-called sequentially multiply adaptive randomized trials, SMART trials, which means after randomizing to intervention and control, those people not doing well in the intervention group get re-randomized to, let's say, a more intensive intervention, and then re-randomized again to another more intensive intervention to essentially see how adaptive we can be. The idea being we should not just focus on the health behaviors of the participants, but maybe on the health promoting behaviors of the policymakers. Here are some initial results. In a 5-city experiment that tried to integrate housing with various cash and social support services, but not with psychiatric services, there were improvements in various housing, social skills, but not psychiatric service outcomes. Note that the main outcome in all of the studies I'm about to present is city-level cost. That's because it was driven by city-level decision makers, often urban planners, and so the health outcomes are often not tracked as well as we might think. In a similar Toronto experiment, it was city-level cost, alcohol abuse, and social relationships that were tracked, but not improvements in medical outcomes. Also, the medical services were not integrated. More integrated experiments, often based out of the housing system, have been going on in the United States, some of them still ongoing, with, again, improvements in city-level cost being the primary outcome, usually from incarceration and emergency room visits that are paid through city programs. There's some improvements in things like substance abuse and homelessness, some improvements in various mental health outcomes measured by direct survey. But in general, I think this is sort of the edge of where we might be able to go as social epidemiologists, but have not yet integrated ourselves sufficiently into this kind of adaptive testing. So in the interest of time, I'll try to wrap up and create some conclusions or more points for where we can go from here. I think the interesting opportunities we have as social epidemiologists are to think about the iterations in design of some of these safety nets, and not so much about monolithic populations. Referring to Dr. Munich's comments, the populations that are served by these safety nets are typically being treated with very blunt instruments. And with blunt instruments, I don't think we should expect more than very blunt results and maybe neutral results. For epidemiologic science, I'm always arguing for the ability for us to do randomized trials, and I recognize it's very hard. We do have increasingly improved observational data opportunities, the near-farm matching and synthetic control approaches being two of them, but it's extraordinarily difficult to be convincing, I think, about the unobserved covariates when we can't do trials very easily. For politics, I think my biggest caveat is that so many of the experiments are at the city level. That's where the political will is. And yet the dollars and the big safety nets are at the federal level, and this is a very fundamental divide that I don't yet know how to solve until you can solve Donald Trump. So I'll end there. Thanks to Dr. Kawachi in particular for inviting me, and I think I'd like to leave by encapsulating some of my comments in this somewhat dated photograph from several decades ago about some of the ironies of the way we discuss standard of living, social and economic opportunities in the United States, and then the daily lived realities of those who are often in our safety nets, which I think is captured well by this picture. Thanks.
Wondering if my slides will show up magically or if I need to do something. Ah, they show up magically. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for Dr. Kawachi and his colleagues for inviting me. It's really an honor and privilege to be here, particularly to follow Dr. Basu. Before I actually start my talk, I just wanted to, since we're here for a population health meeting, I wanted to quickly reflect on population health of another form. Today is the 14th anniversary of September 11 terrorist attacks. 3,000 people died 9/11. About 30,000 American and allied soldiers died after that. About 200,000 were injured, 500,000 had mental illness, and about 500,000 civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan died as a direct consequence of that event. So if the long arc consequences of war are not a population health event, I don't know what is. I just thought it was worth noting that for a second. So I was asked to speak last, which is always dangerous, and in particular to follow Dr. Basu, which is even harder. So rather than trying to capture what he already told us so eloquently, I thought I would do 10 minutes of comments on trying to sort of take a big picture, reflecting really on the day. And some of these thoughts people will recognize have emerged in some of the questions to the earlier speaker. So I actually thought I wanted to ask the question, we're here about population health equity, and the question is, well, okay, so what matters? And what matters most to the question about population health equity? So in order to do that, I wanted to take a step back. So it seems to me like the first thing we need to do is to say, what are we trying to do? And just to remind ourselves what we're trying to do, let me just make sure I understand how things move here. Okay, here we go. Not sure what the text over there is, but let's ignore that. If one thinks of a population, this is a population, what we are not trying to do is deal with a small subset of people at a particular corner. What we actually are trying to do is we're saying, this is population, these are people with pathology, and we are trying to decrease the number of people with pathology and make people better. Now, there's different ways in which we can do that, and we've heard about a lot of them today. But I thought it was worth keeping in mind that our goal ultimately is improving the health of populations. So we can ask ourselves then, are we actually doing that? So is this what we are doing? Well, there's a number of different ways of measuring that. So let me just take an American perspective with apologies to those who are not from here. This is our NIH funding. NIH fund is about a $32 billion budget a year, and about 0.4% of the grants in the NIH year have the words population or public in their title. Now, many of you who are American in the audience will say, well, it's just NIH and they just don't fund population stuff. But it's actually not true, because you can go back 10 years. Anybody can do this, is all public data. And you can actually see that we used to fund 10 times more population health stuff as recently as 10 years ago, and we've actually gone down. It used to be 4% 10 years ago, which one could say, well, it's not that much, but now it's 0.4%. So I think it's important to say, if this is what we're trying to do, is this actually what we're trying to do as a country? And then, just to show you, these are proportion of papers in PubMed. The blue line are with the words population health or public health, something like that. And the red line are papers with personalized individual or precision medicine. And you see that that overtook population health in about 2 years ago. So it's always difficult to remember this when you're in a room like this, because you're sort of in the room with the home team. But we're losing, if this is any indication. So I thought I would ask sort of why not? Again, it's hard to remember this because you're in a room where there's all these people who think like you. You're like, well, it's so obvious. Everybody thinks I'm so smart. We're all right. But so how could this be? And we could rail against forces of evil as much as we want. But that's fine, and that's a fun parlor trick. But I thought it's actually helpful to actually look at ourselves and say, what blame do we have in this sorry state of affairs? And I actually thought that, well, that wasn't intended as 2 lines, but it's kind of effective that way. Why not? I actually thought the best illustration of why not came from New York Times Magazine. I don't know if people saw this. This New York Times Magazine published this terrific 2-page spread. I'll show you the second page in a second. And what they have here is a range of the risk factors that are frequently published in our literature. And there you see pictures of mice. They actually go from mouse literature to human literature. And they color things by lifestyle, diet, pharma, body, genetic, etc. And if you go through this carefully, which you won't, you'll see things like over time. It starts in 2011 and it goes down 2012, 2013, 2014. And these bubbles emerge, like 2011, good study show from a distinguished academic institution saying that blueberries are good for you. And then in 2013, it was actually they're not good for you. And it goes on and on like this. And the point I'm making here is that we have done a terrific job of throwing up against the wall an array of risk factors and then contradicting ourselves and changing our minds, etc. Now, there's always good reason for it, and we academics can always defend and explain its different samples, etc., etc. But that's not how the world sees us. What the world sees us doing is trying to solve population health by throwing up a bunch of risk factors, and it really becomes a risk factor spaghetti, and nobody understands what on earth we're trying to say. That, of course, leads us to the ultimate hall of shame is when your risk factors are on the cover of New Yorker in a mocking way, where you have people, smokers, salt eaters, and carb eaters who are in the stockade. And perhaps my favorite all-time cartoon on this, which is the square peg, which says, with a proper diet, moderate but consistent exercise, and development of a healthy mindset, I should be able to fit into the round hole just fine. So this is sort of what we have wrought up on us. This is what we have where we have brought ourselves. And of course, being at this meeting is a real dose of sanity, because this meeting is organized around things that I tend to think matter, which I'm going to get to in a second. But that, of course, reflects, I think in many respects, sort of intellectual concurrence with Dr. Kawachi and the organizers. But I just want to make it clear that, again, I want to make clear that this meeting is an oasis in a desert. And I think it's important for us to remember that, so we don't want to get too self-congratulatory. So, having said that, how long have we known this? Is this like something that's new? Like, are we just figuring this out right now? Well, actually, not at all. This is a quote from Milton Terrace, who is one of the sort of dead grandfathers of epidemiology. So here's Milton's quote: "We cannot remain indefinitely in our ivory towers. They may crumble around us. We need to foster epidemiologic research, etc." And then but here's the key part. He says, our job is to convince the American public and its legislators that the application of our findings to improve the health of the public must become the highest priority for health policy. And this is actually what I thought Dr. Basu's talk was a perfect reflection of this. I'm sure if Dr. Terrace was here, he would have stood up and applauded. But this is exactly what we are not doing hardly as much as we should be doing in our literature. And this is what, in some respects, a meeting like this is a corrective towards. So one of the things that we have published in literature, which I wanted to share because I think it captures the talks from this morning, and Professor Duncan did a lovely job of setting me up earlier, is this notion of what matters most lens as a solution. And what we have been asking ourselves and what matters most is what is the relative weight of what matters? Ultimately, if you're interested in improving the health of populations, and remember, that's why I started, that's why I was boring you with those gray little people which then become blue, because the question is, what do we care about? And if we care about improving the health of populations, then we should say, well, why do things matter? And why is it that those things matter? So let me just show you a bit of a formalism. And I'll start off with an example, which is a very peculiar American example, which is firearm violence. So let's talk about firearm violence for a second. So this is the number of injury deaths in the United States. This is 2011, hasn't changed that much. But there are about 32,000 firearm deaths in the United States every year. It's about roughly the same as car accidents. It's actually a little bit more this year. So as many people die from car accidents as die from guns. And if anybody's been following the national debate on this, right, there is a mass shooting event roughly every week in this country. If anyone follows the national debate, after every mass shooting event, the answer is, in the media, is maybe the answer is to make sure that crazy people don't get guns, right? So let's make sure that crazy people don't get guns. Now, is there any logic to that? Well, there's some logic to that. Let's look at the logic. This is psychiatric disorders increase the risk of violent behavior. This is a study showing that the more psychiatric disorders, the more likely you are to engage in violent behavior. This is a slide from the National Comorbidity Survey, which you can't really read it, but it doesn't matter. Multiple psychiatric disorders are associated with violent behavior. I don't know what they did with my slides, but it's actually like my slides as impressionistic art. It's okay. I always like to have other avenues of employment in case this dean gig doesn't work out. What the slide compellingly showed, when you could actually read it, was a broad array of newspaper clippings, essentially showing that after firearm events, what ends up happening is the papers all go nuts, so to speak, saying it's all about mental illness. This is some data showing the high-profile mass shootings and the accumulation of records in the National Instant Check System. This is about we actually never used to care about this until about 7 years ago when we started recording these events in a registry around mental illness has really exploded. So like our thinking that, look, I think most people in this country, with some exceptions of some political presidential candidates, really think that mass shootings are a bad thing. But really what we've done is we've invested a bunch of money in saying, let's just make sure that guns don't get in the hands of crazy people. And it's not just them, right? I just want to be clear, it's not just them. This is an editorial published in the New York Times from a distinguished colleague who chairs a large department of psychiatry at a large distinguished American university. And in this, the quote is as follows. The quote is, we must start using the law to treat patients in need over their objections if necessary. The strategy would apply to a small number of people who have psychotic disorders and known risk factors for violence. Good news is that these strategies have proven highly effective and really work. They simply have not been widely applied. And if you read this editorial, it says very clearly that as long as we make sure that people who have mental illness take their treatment, we will reduce gun violence in this country. So here's the question. Is that true? Is it likely to matter? Is it likely to matter much to firearm-related violence in the US? Well, the easiest way to do is actually Professor Basu talked about some natural experiments. So we actually have a natural experiment of this. It's called Canada. Not that far. Cold place, a few people, some bears. But Canada, I know most of you have never been there, and please don't. But Canadians, they're not that different. They're not that different than Americans. They really are not. They look a lot like Americans. They speak similar language. It's really not that different. So when you look at national prevalence data, it's not so surprising. The prevalence of psychiatric disorders is actually pretty comparable. Again, in fact, it's even a little bit lower, but that's because they have much shorter election cycles. We actually have an experiment. We have a counterfactual, we have a live counterfactual, US and Canada, and then you look at firearm homicide rate between the US and Canada. So let's be clear, there are not more crazy people in Canada. There's not more mental illness in Canada. In fact, it's roughly the same, maybe a little bit lower. But so what's causing the difference? Well, what's the difference between the US and Canada in the context of fire and violence is actually the proportion of households that own firearms. So from a point of view of what matters most, it's while I appreciate the point Dr. Lieberman is making in his commentary that we need to make sure we treat mental illness, absolutely, it's inarguably we treat mental illness, but it actually makes no difference whatsoever for the question of firearm violence. What matters here is firearm availability, and that's what underlies the difference between the United States and Canada. So that's example A. Let me give you example B, which is more of a numeric example and more of a schematic. So let's consider another example, and let's consider cognitive ability. So brains, smarts, whatever you want to call it. And by the way, this example is obviously simulated numbers, and you could apply it to your favorite health indicator of choice. So I'm going to ask a simple question. And now it's a sort of a tricky question to ask in a distinguished academic institution because everybody has their own favorite answer to this, and I suspect, so don't tell your neighbor what your answer is. But here's the question. How much of your cognitive ability is determined by your genes? Meaning, how much of the fact that you're smart, because by definition you're smart to come here because you had to find a place and had to find parking, etc. So how much of your brains are due to your genes? I'm just going to pause. And I'd just like everybody to think of a percent in your own head. Okay? So now let me show you a numeric example for a second. And I'm going to go back to my population. So this is a population. So I'm going to simulate a population, and I'm going to make only one assumption. Here's the assumption. The assumption is that genes and environments both matter for people to be smart. That's all, right? So there are two things that matter, genes and environment. You can come up with whatever you want for environment, parents loving you, et cetera, whatever you want. But genes and environments both matter. So in the simulated environment, I'm going to put a bunch of people here in black and say that they have the gene, they have the brain gene. Okay? And a bunch of people then who are in green are the people who are in the good environment. And schematically, I'm going to show you that if you have the black color and the green color, right? Brains, you have the gene and the environment, you become smart. That's the red, high cognitive ability. So I really just want to show you two scenarios. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to throw in some people who get smart at random just because that's actually how it happens. So here's scenario one. Here's scenario one. This is a population, and you have some people who are red already. Those are people who are smart at random. That's fine. But I've made the environment almost entirely green. It's a good environment. And I've put a bunch of people, you see them, the black people who have, now they're dotted just so you can see it, otherwise you couldn't see the two colors. Those are the ones with the gene. So given my schema, remember, given my schema, the people who have high cognitive ability are those who have the gene and the positive environment, which means that the black dots with the green are going to turn red because they are going to become high cognitive ability. So that's what happens. So going back to my question, which is what proportion, how much of our cognitive ability is determined by our genes? Well, with this simple numeric example, everybody here can calculate the relative risk and the population attributable relative risk. Well, looking at that, you all know that the relative risk for proportion of cognitive ability that is linked to genes is very, very high. Because in fact, there's only one person here who is not in positive environment, and that person is not smart. So here, you really have a relative risk of about 334, and a population attributable risk fraction of about 1, where essentially the math from this scenario says the answer to the question how much of our cognitive ability is determined by our genes is all of it. That it's all about our genes. Same schema, different scenario. Different scenario. Notice the same black figures, which are the same genes. I didn't change that. The only thing I changed is the green. I've now changed the green. I've made a small proportion to be the green. So now you have only 2 of the black who happen to be where the environment is green. You again convert those to red. You again calculate the same relative risk and the population attributable risk, and you get relative risk of about 1.7 with an attributable proportion of about 40%. So in other words, the answer to the question, which is what I asked you, how much of our cognitive ability is determined by our genes, is dramatically different depending on changing only the environment. I did not touch the number of people with the gene. All I changed was the environment. I didn't change my fundamental assumption. Now, this is the problem with something like this, everybody says, well, it's all theoretical, you're just making things up with numbers, it's all fine and good. But I'm actually not making things up with numbers. This is Eric Turkheimer and his group have published on this time and time and time again. And this is a very simple accounting for genetic variance and environmental variance. And what you actually see here is the proportion, this is in IQ variance, the proportion of IQ variance that's attributable to genetic factors changes dramatically when you increase SCS, that actually the IQ is attributable to genes in high SCS families. And similarly, this is how much is attributable to environment. In high SCS families, very little is attributable to environment. So this has been shown empirically. So what I'm showing you here is something that has been shown time and time again. But what I want you to go back to is when I asked you to think in your mind, what percent of, what was the question, the way I worded it? How much of your cognitive ability is determined by your genes? It's Friday, it's my excuse. You all thought of a percent, right? You had a percent in your mind. And I would like you to be honest with yourself. And how many of you said, well, that percent depends on the environment I'm in? And I bet that most of you did not do that. Because we are trained to think that these things matter in some inviolable way. But in fact, when one starts to think about the health of populations is inextricable between the biological, the genetic, and the environmental. And the answer to how we can promote population health and how, in the rubric of this meeting, we promote population health equity changes dramatically, depending on what the environment says. So, let me conclude. Having said all this, how do we get to what matters most approach in public health? I actually think discussions like this and meetings like this are one way to get there. I think it's ultimately about metaphor and about how we think of our science. This is my favorite metaphor, at least in my professional life, which is the fish metaphor, right? It's the classic thing where you have two young fish swimming along and the old fish comes at them. And the old fish says, hi, young fish, how's the water? And the young fish say, what water? Because it's ubiquitous, right? You don't actually realize the ubiquity of the environment around you. But this is ultimately what drives population health, these things that are ubiquitous. I think all science is a metaphor, and it's a metaphor that shapes how we think, our knowledge, and our perspectives. And this is an example of sort of a simple metaphor, right? This is New York City, where I was before I moved to Boston. And I like this map because it sort of represents the impossibility of New York City. But a metaphor for this, of course, is this. That's the New York City subway map, right? So this is much more manageable. You can actually understand New York City by looking at the subway map, but it's really a representation of what we saw before. And I think in some respects, going back to what we're doing wrong and the fact that population health is frequently we're not thinking about population health in the right way, and that funding is actually lagging behind on population health and we're throwing risk factors at the wall. Part of what we need to do is make sure that we orient our thinking to make it clear that the drivers of population health are very much the drivers that were discussed today. I think the drivers that were discussed in today's session, and somehow we need to make sure that we can change how populations are thinking about these very drivers of their health. At the end of the day, public health is what we as society do collectively to assure the conditions for people to be healthy. This is from the National Academy of Medicine. And we sort of know this. This is foundational to those who think about population health, but it's not where much of our science has gone. It is where the science is in this room, and I think there's been some lovely examples over the past day and a half of that in this room, and I think that's to the credit of the organizers and to the speakers. I just want to acknowledge that my intellectual partner in this work is Catherine Keyes. We've done a bunch of papers on this, but we're most excited about a book called Population Health Science, which actually is coming out from Oxford in 2016, where we sort of build on these ideas a lot more. That's it. I'll stop there. Thank you for having me.
We lost Taylor. I think he might have gone back to class. But anyway, we have about 10 minutes, and someone standing at the microphone already. If you have, we have time for a couple of questions, maybe. So please identify yourself and go ahead.
A comment for Dr. Basu, which I enjoyed. Oh, my name is David Rush, and I'm going to talk about my time when I was in the School of Public Health at Columbia. I was invited to be the principal investigator of the national evaluation of the other food program for the poor, the WIC program. The WIC program is focused on pregnant women and young children. Many of you are familiar with it. It has many of the characteristics of the program you were trying to test with vouchers. It is a voucher program which is not denominated in dollars, but is denominated in foods. So that whatever the prices were at the store, it was only good for certain foods. The principal investigator before me was fired by the Reagan administration. He had been hired by the Carter administration, and the Reaganites invited me to do this job. We found profound health benefits to the WIC program, including infant head growth size, as well as mortality and other findings. But the reality was that our data were embargoed by the Department of Agriculture. The undersecretary at the time was a former staff member of Jesse Helms, and the strategy at the time was to try to kill the WIC program. And so after a year of great struggle, and it finally was released with our executive summary excised and a new one written by one of their non-professional staff members, which was atrocious. I'll end by saying that what they discovered was that suppressing data that's already collected is extremely difficult, but suppressing the not forming data, not collecting data is actually very easy. So although we showed significant improvement in head circumference, we were unable to show anything more because the funds were withdrawn, and the relatively small amount of money, we had unlimited money practically up till then, was not available to us. And I was obviously very poor at marketing because I couldn't get any private sources to fund this follow-up study. So the reality is that there are political and other forces at work which are way beyond our ability to affect, which probably have far more impact on the conditions that we are hoping to change than we can ever do. I'm not saying we shouldn't keep doing what we're doing, but we live in a large fishbowl. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you for two very elegant presentations. And my question is from Dr. Basu, Professor Basu. You talked about when you were trying to attribute what the benefit was of the various programs, there seemed to be an assumption that they were siloed, whereas in fact, if you're given money for food, there's a fungibility in that. You then don't have to spend, you can spend the $4 on something else. And so it seems to me that the major experiment that needs to be done in terms of welfare safety net is about the minimum wage or about salary levels, because vouchers can be substituted for something else. We're doing one in New Zealand at the moment. We've paid people's electricity bills. But that means, of course, that people don't have to pay the $500 that they would to heat in winter. They can spend it on something else, and therefore they don't actually heat their houses anymore. So I wondered if you could talk about how you view the fungibility of vouchers or direct payments.
Yeah, thank you for that very important point. I think part of what we are trying to do to address that very point is that there's been much descriptive work around, for example, heat or eat phenomenon in terms of how people have to do trade-offs when they're under extreme poverty. And part of what we hope to do is take some of the very models that are used to calculate benefits, so the Thrifty Food Plan in the case of SNAP, and look at alternative mathematical models that try to account, for example, how much people are infra-marginal or not, meaning to what extent are they able to supplement using that dollar versus substitute, and how adjusting those formulas may change the way in which people are able to use the funds. Of course, there are two components to that. One is the political will problem of simply increasing the benefits. Will we actually see benefits in terms of the cycling phenomenon, for example, if benefits are increased sufficiently that it's no longer a desperate cycle. We don't have a natural experiment for that in the United States as far as I know, because it's always been at the exceedingly low level. But the second question is also, even if we're not able to increase the total budgetary allocation, can we allocate more smartly? For example, by not assuming that everyone's going to cook a lentil soup every day. And I think that that's sort of where the direction in which people are going, but the difficulty is that for different people in different locations, those are going to be very different trade-offs. And I think much of the food desert literature has been sort of died in part because the assumption was that all food deserts are sort of the same, or what is the definitional component of a food desert? Is it distance to supermarket? Is it the quality of the food in the supermarket? The trade-offs for individuals in terms of what they're doing in terms of spending food on money for food versus money for diapers are very different depending on where they are. So I think that's part of the challenge.
Hello, I'm Ruth Flint. I'm a student at Harvard School of Public Health. I'm very grateful to be here, and thank you so much for all the interesting talks. I've got a point and then a question. My point is, I think we're actually seeing the effects of what happens if you cut benefits and don't put in place or don't understand how that affects different individuals in the UK at the moment. And most recently, we've seen that the cuts which the Tories have introduced around benefits have actually led to mortality. And there's a big inquiry into that at the moment. And that's because a lot of the people who received those benefits were actually disabled and couldn't necessarily go out and get employment. It was enough that they died within 6 weeks after those cuts. Another thing around that, though, is actually we have enormous problems linking our data sets to be able to understand these sort of, and so our tools are still quite blunt because of that. And I was just wondering whether anyone had any comments on how you've used your research to improve the data sets that you're collecting and actually improve those sort of the minimum base that you have, so that you have the flags of disability, for instance, so that you know you can address that going forward and therefore understand who it's going to affect most, or whether you have a story to share around where you've made a direct improvement to the data you're collecting. Thanks.
Thanks for your question. I think the first thought that comes to mind is I always feel a little depressed when I see presentations like the Finnish cohort presentation earlier, or insert Scandinavian country here, because the linkage is there. Right? And ironically, often, as pointed out, the variation isn't. We have the profound variation, which is a nice way of saying inequality, in the United States to study. But our research data centers and the census data centers in the United States do provide, I think, a wealth of information. And increasingly, we're not anywhere close to the Scandinavian countries, but at least in the US and UK, there are opportunities to link data better. But I think we face sometimes, someone mentioned the big data issues. In epidemiology, that also presents a concern to me, which is that we face what genetics faced 10 years ago, which is the profound threat of false positives. And I think we are going to link our data tremendously to labor data and social safety net data and all sorts of data, and have to think a bit, how do we not end up like the GWAS studies, the genome-wide association studies, where there's a SNP that's related to everything with probably an effect size of rounds to 0. And so I think the linkage is helpful, especially in terms of causal inference and tracking life course data and description. But in terms of creating better interventions, I worry that we'll get into an arms race where the next speaker always has bigger data, but maybe not a clearer question. And so we're, I don't just want a bigger hammer, but a better place to put the nail.
Just want to make one quick comment, extending Professor Basu's metaphor. Yeah, it's not just about a bigger hammer. And I would actually argue that it's being careful as to what nails we're looking for and whether we really do want to get into the game of ever narrower causal isolation for trying to find that single nail. I think in Professor Basu's presentation was pretty clear about the complexity of the production of population health. And if you think about it, much of our causal inferential thinking takes us down the path of where we're trying to sort of isolate the precise single cause that is resulting in something. I think Professor Munich made a point earlier, said, well, he's almost convinced about causal thinking. That was probably one thing I disagreed with him on, because I actually don't know that the game is in isolating the ever narrower cause. Rather, the game is in trying to understand the complexity of causal structures and the architecture of causes that ultimately produce population health. And it's a little bit of a fool's errand to keep going down the path of using ever bigger data to find that one single magic bullet. That went out when we discovered bacteria.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. I'm going to have to, I'm always doing this to Richard, sorry, cut you off, But it is time, and I want to make sure that people can get back to the offices and whatever they're doing. Please join me in an applause for the speakers. The last. And actually, before you go, I'm not sure if they're still here, but all this would not have been possible without the dynamic team that I worked with. You'd be amazed to know that the whole conference, its planning, the logistics, everything was worked out by 3 people, which didn't include me, actually. I just, I sat on the side. But the 3 people, if you're here, just stand up and wave. Yenny So, are you here, Yenny? Maybe she's still at class. And then Circe Lecomte, she's, I think she's being a teaching assistant in my class right now. And then Alberta Zuma, who is here. So please give a big hand of applause for them. Thank you so much. You really did a terrific job. I hope you really enjoyed the last day and a half. We're really pleased with the level of interactions and networking, the questions that we got. We thank the Aetna Foundation again for their generous support of the meeting. And if you really had a great time, spread the word. And next time, maybe we'll see you at the second version of this conference, either as a presenter or again in the audience. So see you, and good luck with everything.